Mr. Bull, on behalf of the state.
I'm just wondering whether or not the defense is delaying any additional record they need to make at the conclusion of the case until after statements.
That was exactly what I was going to say, Your Honor.
They may.
Your Honor, may we have a moment to hook up some cords?
You may. Duplication of some words in one of the instructions. I have the original set of instructions. I have signed these, or I will sign them. These will go back to the jury room with you, and it's this original set that you should sign when you've reached your verdict. I am going to make a correction on this original set and delete those extra words that were in that instruction, specifically number 17.
May it please the court.
Counsel.
Ms. Branstad, Mr. Roush, Ms. Caney, Mr. Olson. She would have been terrified. Those were the words of Jason Carter mere hours after his mother was found on the floor of her kitchen on June 19, 2015. Now, that was one of the 61 clips that we played about 3 or 4 days ago. And I recognize that one clip may have been missed in all of the other clips that we played, and that's just simply human nature. We provided you all of the clips at once. But she would have been terrified, unless she hadn't seen the guy coming up behind her. Now, that interview takes place at the Pleasantville Police Department immediately after Jason Carter, the defendant, and his family is transported there for the purpose of interviews. I think it's important that we do hear that clip again.
It looked like the pigs were fed, he said.
Yep, she fed the pigs. Oh, shit. Poor Mom. I cannot freaking believe it. I cannot believe it. Why her? Jesus.
I don't understand it. For somebody that's an elderly person, that's somewhat defenseless. That just seems like such a overt act for somebody that's so kind, and so gentle. I mean, that's.
She would have been terrified. Unless she didn't even see him coming behind her.
Now, in isolation, that may simply be a slip of the tongue. And we heard the defense tell you in their opening that these clips would be taken out of context. But what did we hear Deputy Bigowit, when he took this witness stand, say? Every single question, the answer that he provided would be immediately after it. We didn't play any games. We didn't at any point say this was an answer to this question. That's not what happened. Now, don't worry. We're not going to listen to all 61 clips again. Okay, I realize this has been a long trial, and you have given us your undivided attention. So I'm not going to take the time to have a PowerPoint presentation with 30-plus slides. I recognize each and every one of you have been taking notes and that you understand the evidence. This is just my opportunity to summarize what were the clues that led to one conclusion, and what did Jason Carter know? When did he know it? And how would he have known that? So let's take a look at the evidence and what has been established. The state has proven that Jason Carter left Cargill at 9:59 in the morning. We saw the video of it. He then drove straight to where he parks his semi, got out of his semi, got into his pickup, and drove straight to his parents' home. Now, we've heard a variety of different statements about how long that drive would take. Trooper Thorpe said, I drove it. It took 50 minutes and 37 seconds. You listen to Bill Carter say, you know what, you can actually do it a little bit quicker, but it really depends if you have a loaded semi or an unloaded semi. But then the defense decided to let us know exactly how long that trip took with Jason Carter behind the wheel. Now, what's important, and the exhibits are here, you'll have an opportunity to watch them if you want, they drove it 3 separate times. They drove it at the speed limit. That's interesting because Jason Carter never once advertised he drove the speed limit that day. He drove it at the rate of speed that he said he drove, and we have to take his word for it because, like I said, when we look to kind of recreate what happened, there are some things we just have to take the defendant at his word for. We don't have any other evidence to support anything other. And then we also have the very quick drive. Well, I think that there's something important that we have to keep in mind. Jason Carter is stuck. He's stuck because for his time to work on the front end, it doesn't work on the back end. And for the time to work on the back end, it doesn't work on the front end. So here's what I'm talking about. There are 2 distinct durations of time that need to be taken into consideration. How long does it take him to get from Cargill to Heberlin? And how long does it take him to go from Heberlin to his parents' home? And we know that there is a distinct moment in time that Jason Carter delineates, right? I texted Charles Smith, bring a load of chemicals to the old man's place. I got X percentage left, etc., etc. Now, Jason Carter, through all the clips that we heard, repeatedly said, Charles Smith responded 10-4. But he didn't. Take a look at what the text says. Now, what's interesting is Jason Carter only one time admits that fact. It's in the interview with Jason Sandholt on June 22nd. Late into it, we heard about how Sheriff Sandholt was sent in at the end as a friend, kind of that good cop, bad cop thing. And it's in that interview, the only time Jason Carter says, you know what? He didn't say 10-4. He said, which of the mix do you need? And we think that's an important clue that you need to take into consideration. Because Jason Carter repeatedly says, I send the text to Heberlin's at the end of the Heberlin driveway. And that text is sent at 10:55. Well, if that text is sent at 10:55, what do we know? Jason Carter hasn't told us the truth on that issue. Because the math doesn't work. It simply doesn't. According to what we know about the time, and you'll have an opportunity if you want to do the math as well. He left Cargill, day of time, driving speed, day of homicide at 11:37. He gets to Heberlin's 47 minutes and 7 seconds later. Well, the math's easy for us to compare to Cargill because he left at 9:59. If he leaves at 9:59, 47 minutes later, he has to wait 8 minutes at the end of the Heberlin driveway to send that text at 10:55. Now, do we all remember when we listened to the radio traffic how uncomfortable it was to sit for 2 minutes in silence as we waited for one person to speak to the other? I mean, I'll be honest, it was uncomfortable for me to be sitting in silence. And maybe it's because I'm a lawyer and I talk for a living. Silence isn't one of those things that I'm real good with handling. But imagine waiting 8 minutes to send that text. If you recall, 8 minutes was exactly the amount of time I asked Judge McCall, could I fast forward at the end so we didn't have to sit in silence as we waited for Sheriff Sandholt to show up? So what does that mean? What do we know from that? Jason Carter, from the very beginning, recognizes he has a problem with his times. How do we know that? Let's look at some of the other things Jason Carter did as it relates to his times. Remember, which gate did he go out at Cargill? He's asked that question 2 days after the fact. Why is that important to law enforcement? Because they're trying to determine which one of the two drives he took. And we learned from the person who worked at Cargill there's a big difference if you get to go out the gate that's right here, because you just pull right on out, versus if you got to go all the way around like Bill went that day because Bill wanted to go this direction. How does Jason Carter, 40 hours or so, 2 days after, when asked what gate you go out, doesn't remember? Now, fair enough. He doesn't remember. But what does he say to law enforcement? And you've heard the clip. You'll have a chance to listen to it again if you wish. Well, if I had to go out this side, it would have added 5 to 10 more minutes. Why is Jason Carter, on June 22nd, already trying to add time to when he's going to arrive? The answer is pretty clear. Because Jason Carter has a fundamental problem. His fundamental problem is he's getting to his parents' home way too soon for the rest of his story to make sense. I got to my parents' house, waited no more than a minute, went right inside. Found my mom, immediately called my sister, she called back. Right? That's his story. But as we know, he doesn't make the first phone call to 11:08 and 40 seconds. If he doesn't make that first phone call to his sister to 11:08:40, what's he been doing for the amount of time he's been at his parents' home? Because when you look at the times, what do we know? If he drives slightly fast, okay, remember, you guys have to evaluate the private investigator's testimony about, watch the video. It was so fast. I mean, 73 and a 65. I mean, I get passed by trucks all the time on I-80 doing that. So we know Jason Carter could do it. He proved it when he took his test. But if Jason Carter just drives something in between that time, he's getting to his parents' home anywhere between 10 and 17 minutes before he arrived, before he calls his sister. So what do we know? We know Jason Carter starts by trying to come up with the story about the zerts being greased. Now, we heard from Ms. Branstad in her opening, you know, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, Jason never told that to law enforcement, so don't hold it against him. Well, what do we know? There's a whole lot Jason Carter didn't tell law enforcement in his first interview, right? Doesn't ever tell them about his second phone. He also doesn't ever tell them that he bought gasoline in a 2-gallon jug. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So, what's important, at least from the state's perspective, is pay attention to what Jason Carter is inconsistent on. Because what you will find through the evidence in this case, Jason Carter is inconsistent on the things that directly link him to the crime, such as what time did he get there. Because if he's getting there 44 or 45 minutes later, we're just splitting the difference between day of speed and 43 minutes. And remember, those times have this built-in artificial 2-minute buffer that they just added. The amount of time it took him to get out of the vehicle and get into the other pickup. We saw it. Does that possibly mimic shutting off your semi, hopping up, and hopping into your pickup? That's going to take you a minute or a minute and a half to do. And then we waited to the end of the driveway and we sent the text message. That is absolutely fascinating. That for the very first time that day, Jason Carter was cautious in his texting, right? Because he sent 50 text messages to Mrs. Hoke that morning on a phone that didn't have a keyboard, and he never once pulled over his semi that was loaded with thousands of bushels of corn on the way down there. But on this text message, he paused at the end of the driveway, waited a minute to use the keyboard phone to send it at 10:55, where we know that can't possibly be true. It mathematically is impossible. He then goes inside. But the evidence establishes we know what he did in that time. Let's remember what this home looks like. A modest, traditional home in a rural setting. There's a basement that's dimly lit. In that basement, in one room, is a gun safe. In that gun safe, based on the pictures you've seen, there are multiple guns, but only one is taken. It's the one with the ammunition. Jason Carter, for some reason, needed the brown jersey gloves, because it's only the second thing that's missing from the home. Gun, spent shell casings, brown jersey gloves. We know that the person who loads the gun in the first room fumbles. There's a bullet that's dropped in the lip of the safe. Makes perfect sense if you're wearing big, bulky, brown jersey gloves. Probably not something you've ever done to try to load that .270 bolt-action rifle with a pair of gloves on. So then they move to the more lit area of the laundry room. How do we know that? The piece of plastic that holds the bullets is found in that room. We know the gun was there that morning. How do we know that? Jason Carter had to take the gun caps off. He put them up on the safe. There's no dust on them. That entire room, even the photographs, you can see this is a dust-filled environment. But the bullet and the scope caps don't have any dust on them. In that amount of time, Jason Carter went downstairs, got the weapon, struggled to load it in the first room, went to the laundry room where it was better lit, loaded it, left the piece of plastic behind, came upstairs, and shot his mom. And then he racked another round and shot her again. We then learn that 911 isn't the first phone call Jason makes. But when he does call 911, he says some fairly interesting things. Now, I recognize you've only heard this 911 call once. I would encourage, if you're interested, to listen to it again. Eliminate how Jason Carter is saying things, but only listen to what Jason Carter is saying. I think when you do that and you think critically about the evidence, there's some things that will rise to the surface. The first is, Jason Carter's first comment is, "I need an ambulance quick." Okay. That seems logical, doesn't it? Except he's already said to his sister, "There's nothing I can do to help. She's dead." Why isn't Jason Carter asking for law enforcement to arrive? He knows ambulance saves people's lives. Police officers investigate crime. But he isn't asking for the police, he's asking for an ambulance. Now, small detail. But what does he do next? He says repeatedly to the 911 dispatch individual, "I don't know what happened." Count how many times Jason Carter says in that 911 call, "I don't know what happened." You're not supposed to know what happened. How is he trying to get assistance for his mom? Or rather, is he starting the first part of staging to create the misdirection from the logical person? Next, he says I found my mom lying in a pool of blood. Now, again, this is one of the things that I think is open to interpretation. Was she lying in a pool of blood? Was she not lying in a pool of blood? When could you see the pool of blood? Is it unreasonable and unfair for the state to be critical of a person who finds a body? Any amount of blood when you see it that your mom is going to be a pool of blood? Different descriptions from different witnesses. I concede all of that fact. But it's Jason Carter's comments to his wife when he doesn't know anyone is listening or watching, which is most telling. I thought we had it going. There we go. Well, as we try to... Oh, here we go. Well, you know what? Sometimes we're just going to talk about it, okay? Jason Carter in this video clip says... Why don't we just stop it? I know what he says. There's no blood. I don't get it. There's no blood. There's no spatter. There's no blood. And then he goes on, and keep in mind this is after he's made Lori Goff, a woman he knows, baffled by his comment of, is she dead? Despite the fact she's been sitting there for 3 hours listening to Jason Carter say she's dead, she's been shot. Now we hear, did she have a stroke? You know, she would have had something in her hands and it would have gone. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Now, there's a variety of additional inconsistent statements during this time that the state could point out. But there are things like, when did you recognize the blood? When did you recognize the bullets? Did you see the blood before or after you called 911? And that's what the reason why we played the clips that we did. Because Jason Carter, under oath, says, I didn't see the blood until I went in the second time after hiding my phone. But he told the 911 dispatcher about the blood and about the holes. The truth is consistent. You got to remember when you're being dishonest what you said and who you said it to. But let's just think about this for a second. Just as humans. You walk in. You find your mom on the floor. You think she's either had vertigo and laid down, or you think that she has gotten up on a step. Now, I walk in and I find my mom in that situation. I go to her aid. I go try to touch her neck. I try to figure out what I can do. What you don't do is simply shake her pant leg. He didn't even try to get her a cold rag for her forehead. Or if you saw a little blood, a towel. He doesn't do any of those things. If his first reaction is mom has fallen or mom has vertigo, why does Jason Carter do nothing to provide aid? What does Jason Carter know that at that moment in time law enforcement didn't? And next we learn that in the midst of this emotional trauma, in the midst of finding what could only be described as one of the single worst things another person can find, a loved one deceased, Jason Carter defies logic. Now, just because you took an oath to be a juror doesn't mean you checked your common sense at that door every morning. Jason Carter, we know, doesn't act in a way that seems reasonable, does he? We have fight, We have flight or we flee. Fight, flight, or flee. Jason Carter doesn't do any of those things, does he? In the alternative, Jason Carter chooses option 4, self-preservation. Hide my second phone. In the midst of this trauma, how do you rationalize that 911 call? How do you rationalize that 911 call plus the additional knowledge that at some point you realize your mother has been shot? With, I step over my mother's body twice. The first time as I exit, I go to my car, I open my car or my truck door, and he doesn't even just toss the phone in. Doesn't throw it underneath the seat. No, he has to unlatch the hood, open it up, open the fuse box, put the phone inside. And then he comes back in. And this is where there's a disagreement based on what the evidence says. Jason Carter tells us he never left the kitchen. Bill Carter says, I saw him on the deck as I walked in. I walked right in. And this now leads us to the next. What does this tell us, or how does this make sense? Why is Jason Carter not afraid? He's not scared in any way. He's come in, he's found his mother dead, he sees all these holes, he puts it together, mom's been shot, but he's not afraid. He's not afraid for himself. He's not afraid for his father, who's about to walk in. Why does Jason Carter realize there's no reason to be afraid of the bad guy? What action did Jason Carter take on June 19th that demonstrates for one moment Jason Carter had any fear or apprehension? Is that logical? Is that common sense? There's a reason why when my wife and I go to a new city, there are streets, regardless of how lit they are, we don't walk down. Because you don't know the unknown. We're afraid of what we don't know. But Jason Carter on June 19, 2015 is faced with one of the single most emotional, challenging moments in time, finding his mother. But he doesn't have any of the natural emotions that common sense would tell us that you'd have. He's not fearful. He doesn't freeze, flight, or flee. And he doesn't try to provide her any basic medical care. Why? Then we also quickly learn, and it's a clue, Jason Carter immediately recognized the hole in the fridge and the hole in the floor. Fair enough. They're right there. It's not that Jason Carter immediately recognized the hole in the fridge and the hole or defect in the floor. I'm not certain we can even call it a hole. It's how he processed the information that he knew. He immediately recognized that hole was caused by a rifle. How would you know that? We met D. Lane. He said he's been a hunter his whole life. What could he tell? Not a .22, not birdshot. But caliber? No way. We then met Jana Lane, the sister of the defendant, the daughter of Shirley. What do we know? She's a hunter, but she has additional skills, right? She worked in corrections. She was a firearms instructor during a time in which she was in corrections. And what does she tell us? I've shot rifles, I've shot handguns, I've trained people on those. You can't tell the difference. You wouldn't know. It's not .22. It's not birdshot. But I have no idea. And that point was driven home by Vic Murillo on cross by the defense. If you remember, defense counsel asked Vic Murillo, What would if we just saw a hole in the wall, what would we be able to tell? And Mr. Murillo, from my perspective, somewhat looking puzzled, says you wouldn't be able to tell anything. You know it's a hole. And defense counsel agrees with him. Right. You wouldn't be able to tell anything. Yeah. You shouldn't be able to immediately look at a hole in a refrigerator and know it's caused by a high-powered rifle. But Jason Carter knew that. How does Jason Carter know that? Just shut it off. We're fine. What else do we know? Jason Carter knew his parents' home had been burglarized. But pay attention when you go back and you listen to the clip. What Jason actually says the first time he explains it to law enforcement. Jason Carter doesn't say, Dad, you've been robbed. Dad, you've been burglarized. Or, Dad, look at this. Jason Carter's choice of words is, look, Dad, it looks like someone tried to rob you. That's a very interesting choice of words when someone has tried to make it look like a burglary. What else do we know? We know that within mere minutes of James Lane, the first officer arriving on the scene, not Kurt Sudden, the first EMT, but James Lane, Jason Carter has gone from, I don't know what happened, to literally within probably 18 minutes to knowing his mother has been shot during an attempted burglary, the gun came from the home, and the shooter took the gun with him. In 18 minutes. Jason goes from 911, repeatedly, I don't know what happened, to immediately knowing everything that happened. Now, the next part's going to take a little bit of effort on your folks' part, if you desire to do so. But you are able to calculate exactly when people arrived, if you so desire. Now, what we know is, from that 911 call that we hear Jason Carter, we hear the tones pinging out. Those are the tones that tell Melcher Dallas Rescue to respond. And then we can start to calculate times. We learn that it takes about 11 minutes and 25 seconds for Kurt Seddon to arrive on the scene. It takes James Lane about 19 minutes to arrive. So what does that tell us? We also know from James Lane's camera as he pulls in, Bill Carter is not there. We know where he is. Bill Carter tells us I'm checking on the chores. Jason Carter says he's checking on the chores. When we try to figure out when it is that he's checking on the chores, we can do the math and work backwards to know it's in between the time Kurt Seddon has arrived and called that 1079 call the second time and James Lane arriving on the scene. And we know from the cell phone records that Bill Carter arrived while Jason Carter was talking to his sister, and that phone call ends right around 11:18. We then know that the scene's closed off. Lori Goff and the others told us that, and James Lane himself told us, we made it abundantly clear. Get in, get out, preserve the scene. So the scene's preserved. The family's outside. And Brad Kaufman shows up. Now keep in mind, at the time Brad Kaufman shows up, who is he to Jason Carter? He's a friend. Person he's gone to ag things with, farm equipment shows. He's someone he's talked to about going into business with. If Brad Kaufman could have gotten out of his non-compete, they would have had a seed company together. What does Brad Kaufman tell us? One, I asked Jason Carter what happened. And Jason Carter tells me, I got to my parents' home, I went, started the tractor, engaged the PTO, and greased the zerts. Well, we know on that day, as Bill Carter told us, a law enforcement officer went and they looked at the zerts. Jason Carter then subsequently indicates he didn't grease the zerts, and that's fine. We've never asserted he did. We're just curious as why he would tell a person in the farm business who isn't going to be confused that he did grease the zerts. But it's the second comment that Jason Carter made to Brad Kaufman, which from the state's perspective is so incredibly telling. Jason Carter told Brad Kaufman, I went inside, I found my mom, I saw the office was ransacked, and my parents' bedroom was ransacked as well. Huh. That's curious, isn't it? Because Jason Carter never left the kitchen. Jason Carter never told anyone the bedroom was ransacked. Bill Carter told us, I went and looked at my pistol in the closet in my bedroom, but I didn't see that. I went in, checked, I came back. Bill was more concerned about his wife on the ground than anything else that was happening that day. How does Jason Carter know his parents' drawers had been pulled out? Jason Carter was never in the room. And we watched the video footage of Bill Carter's home. If you remember, upstairs, there's a gentleman carrying the camera, and you see front and you see where he's standing. Well, I can tell you that was by design, because I wanted each and every one of you to know exactly where you had to be standing to be able to tell when those drawers were dumped out and what was on the ground. Because remember, they're just greeting cards with some socks put on top of them. But you cannot see that until you get around the corner of the bed, because the bed's blocking your view of what you can see on the other side. How does Jason Carter know his parents' bedroom is ransacked for any other reason than Jason Carter's the one who did it? What else do we know Jason Carter knew, and when did he know it? We had an opportunity to listen to Trooper Thorpe's. It's really audio because it's just a camera. What is Trooper Thorpe's audio capture? Remember, he's the person who's called, redirected from going to Des Moines. His job is to stay with the family. And we hear audio. Now, it is important that we understand the interplay here between multiple people. You have Billy Carter, the son, brother, showing up. And Billy explained to us, I said that they shoot her with the .270. And why was that a concern to him? Because it's the best gift he ever bought his parents. And he didn't want that to be what killed her. And we hear Jason Carter explain what happened. And Jason Carter says she was shot in the side. We know that because of the interplay that happens next. Billy Carter then goes through and he's asking questions. And he says things like, is she still wearing clothing? Trying to determine whether or not his mom was a victim of sexual assault and then homicide. And then he says something to the effect of, it's okay, she wasn't shot in the face, she was shot in the side. He had heard that minutes or seconds before from Jason Carter. How would Jason Carter know his mom has been shot in the side? What did we hear from Miss Goff and from Deputy Lane? There's a hole right here in the shirt. That's what you can see. She's laying on the ground. The side she's shot on, she's right up next to the chairs and the table. How does Jason Carter know she's been shot in the side? There's only one way he knows that. And what else do we know Jason Carter knows? I put up the little fragment he found. Now I'll tell you, if you don't know what you're looking for, you don't see that little fragment in the bag, do you? But Jason Carter immediately knew where to look to find that fragment and dig it out. As Special Agent Ludwig said, he called it a chunk. How is it Jason Carter knows all of this information, shot in the side during an attempted... It just doesn't make... There's only one conclusion to these clues. Jason Carter's the one who pulled the trigger. In addition to that, do you think whoever would have done this would have had to rack another round? Now, it is clear that Billy Carter is somewhat the son, the outcast of the family. I don't think there was any doubt of that. He shows up, the only gift he's ever bought his parents. But what does he say? He's an emotional wreck. He had to get someone to drive him all the way from Ankeny to be there because he was crying so hard. And his brother takes him aside with his dad, and they walk down to the bottom of the hill of the driveway. We know that happened. D. Lane verifies the 3 Carter men all walked away. I didn't go with him. It wasn't my place. Bill's there. Jason's bent over. Jason's getting his back patted by Bill, and hey, you think they would have had to rack another round? The gun that's in question is a bolt-action rifle. Yes, they did rack another round, and Jason Carter knew that because he's the one who pulled the trigger. Now, Judge McCall just read us the jury instructions. There's a few I want to focus on. The first is what we generally refer to as the marshalling instruction. It's what does the state of Iowa have to prove for you to find Jason Carter guilty of murder in the first degree? And I said in the opening, there wasn't a whole lot that was going to be in dispute. Now, I don't know whether or not my colleagues from the defense are still going to agree, so I'm going to cover everything just to be certain. But this isn't whether or not someone committed murder in the first degree. There's no dispute someone committed murder in the first degree. The question is the who is that somebody, and that's what I told you in my opening statement. So we have to establish on June 19th that Jason Carter shot the defendant. We have to establish that Shirley Carter died as a result of being shot, that the defendant acted with malice aforethought, the defendant acted willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly, and with a specific intent to kill. So let's talk about those for a second. We established Shirley Carter died on June 19th. We established Shirley Carter died as a result of being shot. Whoever committed this offense acted with malice aforethought, willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly, and with a specific intent. So what's that mean? This wasn't an accident. The gun came from downstairs, had to be loaded, brought upstairs, shot a second time. Whoever committed this offense acted willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly. These elements have been met. The only fighting point is who pulled the trigger, not once but twice. Next, let's take a look at reasonable doubt. And as I told you during Vadar, this used to be a topic I covered at great length. Go ahead and put them all up. The reality is, all of you who look at this instruction is going to interpret this a slightly different way. Ultimately, what it means is, are you convinced? Would you not hesitate? The only thing I want to spend a moment or two on is just a clarification. Our jury instructions anticipate, almost demand, you're going to have a conversation and deliberate among yourself. I don't want any of you to think that if any time during the deliberation process you hesitate in reaching the conclusion that you did, that means you have a reasonable doubt. Sometimes what I've heard, and to my horror, is that someone said, when I walked in there, I wasn't there yet, and so I didn't think I could change my mind and get there because I had a hesitation. That's not what this instruction means. What it means is, after a full and fair consideration of the evidence, after you deliberate and you vote, if at that point you are firmly convinced, then vote to find Jason Carter guilty. So let's turn our attention very briefly back to the crime scene. The crime scene was staged. Common sense told us that. Nothing was taken except the things that were used to commit the offense. But what that means is something that a person like Joe Kennedy, with 25 plus years of experience as a NCIS officer and a guy who goes around the globe solving crimes, has to tell us. It's important because staging demonstrates it wasn't an interrupted burglary, and it wasn't a burglary. Staging means this wasn't a stranger who committed this offense. Burglars are strangers who commit burglaries. No one walks in for the purpose of trying to make it look more like a burglary. That just doesn't make sense. The fact that this crime scene was staged, and keep in mind, this doesn't take long amount of time. I literally could walk over and do what Jason did in the office area on this table in what, 10 seconds? And then we can count the number of steps it takes us to walk to the bedroom, to open 2 drawers, knock off some cards, and put some socks in. This was not an extensive period of time. Staging means you are trying to distract from you, the perpetrator. Jason was trying to distract law enforcement from determining he was the one who was responsible. Because if you think about it, if Jason doesn't do that, what does this crime scene look like? Shirley Carter's just shot in the home, in her kitchen. There's no ability for Jason to orchestrate, what about these other people that we heard all about the last 2 days? If Jason Carter doesn't create that noise, we don't hear anything about that. Because the only reason that story, these alternative suspects, make sense is because it's an attempted burglary. Well, who caused the attempted burglary? Jason Carter, by staging. We next talked about the gun safe, the fingerprints on the gun safe. Well, let's keep one thing abundantly clear. The state of Iowa did not, has not, and does not contend that Jason Carter left a fingerprint on the safe on June 19, 2015. Doesn't make any sense for him to take the gloves. Jason Carter was absolutely convinced he didn't leave any fingerprints behind, wasn't he? I never touched the gun. I never touched the bullets. I never touched the safe, ever. Jason Carter was firmly convinced we weren't going to find his fingerprints. That's why the gloves are missing. The issue is not his fingerprints are on the safe. It's why is Jason Carter distancing himself from the safe. Jason Carter knows that safe is there. He bought it. He put it together. And most importantly, the day before he tells law enforcement, never touch the gun, never touch the bullets, never touch the safe, ever, he tells his sister when they're going on their private detective scavenger hunt in the basement, as Jan Elaine goes to look to see if the gun would fit in the sump pump, what does she hear Jason Carter say? Dad, it wouldn't fit in there. Dad never liked that gun. Didn't fit in the gun safe. 24 hours before, he's saying it doesn't fit in the gun safe. 24 hours later, he's saying I didn't even know the gun safe existed. And if he hadn't bought it and put it away, put it together, he would have gotten away with that statement. The point isn't that his fingerprints are all over it. It's why is Jason Carter distancing himself from that piece of evidence. We next, after Mr. Kennedy, met Mr. Valencius. This is a man who spent his entire professional life protecting others as a member of the NYPD Blue, a man who uses his substantial knowledge and skill to hunt terrorists and keep New York City safe. He told us there are multiple towers at 132 Perry Street. We've heard there's as many as 5. I don't dispute that. There's as many as 5. But what the evidence in this case establishes is Jason Carter's phone tells the story. Take a look at the maps that were provided by the state. On the morning of June 19th, Jason Carter creates a stepladder between 2 cell towers. When Jason Carter is where we know him to be, in the house when he's calling 911, by the big tree when he calls the sheriff, on the driveway when he's accounted for on video, he bounces off one of 2 towers. There is a 3-minute time frame where Jason Carter's phone travels north and to the east. Now, Mr. Valencius didn't try to stretch the facts. He wasn't someone who was getting paid to just come in and say whatever one of the sides needed to say. He came in and he said, I can't tell you how far he went. I can't tell you whether or not it's X number of feet or X number of miles. What I can tell you is on June 19th, that phone moved, and it moved to the north and to the east. And every other phone call he made that day bounces off those two towers. That's what the evidence is. Jason Carter's handset moved. Now, I do want to spend just a few moments, and then I will sit down, talking about the defense experts. And I want to start with their forensic pathologist. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that their forensic pathologist is not an expert. He absolutely is. That man probably has forgotten today, more in today's time, more about forensic pathology than I'll ever learn in my lifetime. He is a legend in the field, and you saw that when he testified. He was personable. He was articulate. He knows his stuff. He is an outstanding professional witness. That's how he earns his living, and he's good at it. I don't begrudge him in any way. With all that being said, his information coming out is only as good as the information coming in. We've all heard the term garbage in, garbage out. And I would respectfully submit that unknowingly, the defense failed to give the doctor all the information he should have had. We heard in 1982, he writes an article that says, I should get all this information. But the defense doesn't give him James Lane's report. Why does the defense not want their expert to know what the observations of the first police officer who's on the scene? Because James Lane says the blood's still wet. Well, if the blood's still wet, that doesn't fit their time frame. We next had an opportunity to listen to some of his other comments and how he reaches his conclusions. But it's important to keep in mind that on the issues where the science is clear, because if you recall, he told us time of death, not an absolute science. But on the things that aren't clear, what do we know for certain? He said Shirley was shot, agreeing with the state. Shot with a rifle, agreeing with the state. Shot 2 times, agreeing with the state. The shooter was standing by the back door, agreeing with the state. When the science is clear, when it's fact-driven, we don't have any dispute. But they didn't call him for that. They called him to say she was dead at X time, or during this time range. But let's take a look at what he bases that opinion on. Shirley was cold, Shirley was stiff, right? That's it. That's the only thing he can draw his opinion to. Well, this is important because the evidence is clear, but this is a distraction. I'll be completely honest. It's a distraction because it relies only on half-truths, and somehow it gets manipulated in a way to be packaged by an expert who's articulate. And that scares the state. So let's look at what he actually examined to rely on his opinion. Cold and stiff. How does Jason Carter know his mother is cold? He didn't touch her. He didn't touch her. At best, he touched her pant leg, those blue jeans. He doesn't touch her. She's stiff. What did the doctor tell us? You have to manipulate joints to get stiff. You can't just touch someone on their shin over their pants and say they're stiff. But what do we know happens? It's a situation where Bill Carter comes up and he adopts and parrots the statements of his son. Because his son's been there longer than he has. So then Bill's heard saying she's cold and stiff. We also heard Bill say, I'm mad at law enforcement. The moment they say The public doesn't need to be worried. I'm aggravated by that. I'm angry by that. I'm not for one moment disputing Bill Carter thought when he kissed his wife she felt cool. He's kissed his wife for the last 52 years. I am certain at that moment in time she felt differently than any other time he has ever kissed her. But what do we know? Scientifically, we're not all 98.6. We're not all 98.6 at the same time every day. We know that the skin cools faster than your core body temperature, and we know Shirley is right up against the vent that's blowing 73-degree air on her. Our common sense tells us, how many times do our kids say they're burning up, and you do this or this, and you take their temperature and they're at 99 degrees, or they're running a low-grade fever, but they felt like they were burning up. The textbook that their doctor looked at told us we've come a long way because we used to just do this. But he's relying on just this for that decision. Because Bill Carter kissed his wife. And he felt that she was cool. That's his testimony. Now, we also heard from Lori Goff. And I think it was abundantly clear Lori Goff was nervous. She isn't a hired gun like their forensic pathologist. She's a local PA in a small town in an EMT. And what do we know? She came in. She was in there for a minute. She touched carotid artery through gloves. Now, we heard the doctor say one thing. We heard Lori tell us in her experience, that's a barrier. She concedes that fact. Dr. Rutsch may just be that good that it doesn't affect him. I'm not certain if you're doing autopsies how often you need to be determining and figuring out the temperature of the body, but that's a whole nother story. But the reality is here, she said, it's not within my expertise. I shouldn't have offered an opinion. I felt pressure. And somehow, when someone says, you know what, that's not what I do, they want to use her information to bolster their opinion. Folks, what evidence is there she was cool and stiff? Cold and stiff. By every single person who gives that statement, one of them has no basis of knowledge and the other one's based on a kiss for a woman who felt cool to him. That does not establish the standards and the requirements that are necessary to get to the conclusion the doctor got to. And though I respect him, it is garbage in, garbage out. And the last question I asked, I thought was most telling. Remember the last paragraph he read you? If you're going to be honest and sincere, this probably isn't the right career path. And Miss Branstad caught it. She said, explain that to us. And what did he say? He laughed. And he said, I believe it more today than ever before. He gets paid a lot of money to do what he did. And he's good at it. But it doesn't mean what he told you is supported by the facts as we know it in this case. And then we met Mr. Harrington. As I listened to his testimony, it reminded me of an ad when I was a child. Trident gum. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Trident gum. And being the kind of kid I was, my question always was, who was the 5th dentist? Well, we learned as it comes to cell phone towers and interpretation of maps, he's the 5th expert, right? At some point, I'm not going to harp on his mistakes. I'm going to point out what his testimony was, though. I was hired at the 11th hour. I'm not educated in this. I don't have formal education. I don't have training. I don't testify. He even said, look, I'm not a hired gun, which is interesting when he's following the hired gun. And what do we know? He made mistakes. But the defense wants you to believe that a guy who can't write the towers down is a person who you should trust. A person who doesn't know whether or not you map voicemail calls or not. He's a guy whose opinion you should trust. A person who doesn't put all the phone calls on there is a person you should trust. You're going to have to decide, who do you believe? Mr. Valencius or Mr. Harrington? We've established he had the means and the opportunity. That only leaves us left with motive. And I told you in this in my opening statement, this case wasn't about money. It was about pressure. What pressure was Jason Carter going through? Very quickly. He decides to quit his full-time job, become a full-time farmer, buys a whole lot of equipment. You listen to Brandon Smith, who sold him the equipment, who told us he had more equipment than he needed for the amount of acres he was farming. What else did we learn? He has 2,000 acres and he loses about a fourth of it when Mabel McDonald passes away and Mike McDonald decides to sell the land. At the same time, commodity prices are collapsing. He's feeling financial pressure. He has all of these liabilities, and the only assets he has, he doesn't have any land, is purely the equipment. We know, according to Bill, Jason wants to buy land, but Bill isn't willing to give it to him, or it's not the right land. What do we know? We know that on June 19th, on June 22nd, when Jason Carter is interviewed, he says, I'm 50 grand in the hole. If I had to sell everything, pay back my notes right now, I'd be in the red. But more importantly than that is, what else does Jason Carter know? Jason Carter knows that his mom isn't a farm wife, she's a farmer. He knows his dad's willing to slow down. He knows that his dad has demonstrated his willingness to slow down. All of the other acres Jason Carter farms is directly related to the fact that his dad has gone to the landlords and given it to him. He's repeatedly asked. He's asked by Brandon Smith, why don't you farm with your parents? His comment is, I can't work with that bitch. There was friction. We got told we were going to hear this story about this loving family with no conflict, and what you heard was just the opposite from Mr. Carter, Bill, and from Brandon Smith. I'm sure to people who were watching, Jason Carter said all the right things. But we also know that that financial stress was problematic because he told Terrace Hoke about it. She knew about it. That his credit line being delayed was something they talked about. So we have all this pressure, and something happens. There's an altercation. And Shirley Carter dies as a result. There's only two people in this world who know what happened on June 19, 2015. And one of them is dead, and the other one's sitting behind me. Based on the evidence, and in support of that evidence, the state of Iowa requests that you find Jason Carter guilty of murder in the first degree and sign form of verdict number 2. Thank you.